Once upon a time, there was a king, the most common opening for a fairy tale told in any part of the world. As a 7-year-old, I never contested this. I never questioned my storytellers which king, what name, which kingdom. I accepted this as the supreme eternal truth that once upon a time there was a king. But 7-year-olds of today do not accept it like that. If you just tell them once upon a time there was a king, they'll ask so many questions that you would feel as if a CBI investigation is in process. For instance, they would ask, which king? So you would say something like, well, once upon a time there was a king named Ajatashatru. And then they would ask, which Ajatashatru? Oh Lord, how can anybody tell or listen to stories with so much interruption? Anyway, I like recollecting those good old days when life was really uncomplicated and unsophisticated because there was only one thing to believe in, which is once upon a time there was a king. And so it happened that it was the monsoon season and it had rained the whole day. And in the evening, I was sitting on the veranda, fervently praying that the rains should get heavier, even though the rains had already flooded the city. Don't ask me which city, okay? It doesn't matter. And I had an ulterior motive behind that prayer because I knew that every day at 7:30 my tuition teacher makes his way to our home, and that day I just didn't want him to come. But if my prayers were getting answered and the rains were getting heavier, then his willpower and determination were also getting stronger. Because dot at 7:30 I could see at the end of the lane the tip of his umbrella. And now I have to warn you that if you are a parent, grandparent, uncle, aunt, cousin, or sibling to a 7-year-old, you must stop listening to this right away because I'm going to make a terrible confession. And if you have proceeded, it's at your risk. I ran to my mom and I told her, Mom, the tuition teacher has come, but oh, I have such a bad headache. Can I do without the lessons today? Well, I don't know what my mother made out of it, but she did tell the servant, tell the tuition master to go back today. Some victories are indeed quite sweet. But you see, it's very difficult for a 7-year-old to keep up the pretense of an illness at such short notice or even long notice. So for about a minute, I was able to keep up. After that, I buried my face on the pillow and laughed my heart out. And after that, all pretense was washed away. I grabbed the arm of my granny who was sitting next to me on the bed playing cards with my mother and said, Granny, tell me a story. But obviously they were busy and could not entertain my request. But I was persistent. And so, after some time, my mother said, all right, you take care of this child. And she left the room. And I had Granny all to myself. And she started the story for the evening with the great grand sentence, once upon a time, there was a king. And this king had a queen. And I tell you what, I was really very glad to hear that the king had only one queen. Because you see, fairy tales have this habit of having more than one queens for a king. And when there are more than one queen, in such instances, you can be assured that only one would be happy and the rest of them, they would be either fighting, plotting, be full of jealousy and whatnot. And for a 7-year-old, all this is really very difficult. It's too much. So I was very happy that this king had only one queen. Then Granny said that unfortunately this king did not have a son. And at that point in time of my life, I could not really understand the gravity of the situation. because for all I knew, the son could be on his way. And therefore, when Granny said that the king had retired to the forest to pray deeply to the gods that he be blessed with a son, I was not impressed. It was totally lost on me. Anyway, the king did move into the forest, whether or not I was impressed. And in doing so, he left behind in the kingdom his queen and little daughter. 12 years passed, and the daughter grew up into a beautiful princess. She was in the full bloom of her youth, and the age of her marriage came and went. But the king did not return. And this upset the queen very much. And she cried, "Oh, what fate is mine? Is my golden daughter destined to die unmarried?" And so she sent men to the forest to bring back the king. She said, "At least come for a day, or for a night, or at least come for a meal." The king agreed. And so, to welcome him, the queen herself did all the cooking. She cooked 64 different dishes and laid them all out in plates of gold and cups of silver and put it out in front of a seat made from sandalwood. And behind that seat stood the young princess, ready to fan her father once he sat down. Now, obviously, as the king entered the hall, his eyes fell on the princess, and he turned to the queen and asked, "Pray, who is she? She whose beauty reflects the golden image of the goddess? Whose daughter is she?" And at this, the queen wept once again. "Ah, what evil fate is mine! Don't you recognize your own daughter?" "She is my daughter. Who else can she be? She's grown up so big. How else could it be?" "Well, why didn't you get her married off? As if you were available to find a suitable husband for her." The king agreed that this was indeed a valid point, and he set out to make amends. He announced that next day in the morning, when he steps out of the palace, he would get the princess married to the first man he saw. "What then, Granny?" I was so curious. Granny hushed me and asked me to continue listening. Now, next day when the king stepped out, his eyes fell on the son of a Brahmin who was collecting sticks. And so he made the announcement, "Get that boy. He is to be married to our princess." Ha! Well, who could interfere with the king's command? So the boy was brought in, and hastily marriage garlands were exchanged, and the princess took her new boy husband and left the palace to go away to live in a faraway land where she built her own beautiful palace with 7 wings and started living there. Now you see, it's very good that my grandmother was only a grandmother. At that age, had she been a writer, editors and the society would have made life very difficult for her. Editors would have asked her very difficult questions like, why was the king away for 12 years? That too in the forest. Why did the princess stay unmarried for 12 years? How come? And then all the pradhans of the Khap Panchayats and the other moral polices, they would come after her saying, "How did you get a warrior caste married to the Brahmin caste?" Oh, thank God. My grandmother was not an author. And immediately I prayed That in her next birth also she should be born only as a grandmother, not as an author. This was quite different from the wish that I had for my tuition teacher, for whom I had prayed that in his next birth he should be born as me and I should be born as him. But anyway, my grandmother was born a grandmother and she was telling me this fairy tale in her capacity as a grandmother. And so she went on to say that the princess sent her boy husband to a school next to the new palace that she had built. And in that school, this boy learned many new things from the teachers, and also he made many new friends and companions. And all of them had one question for him. Hey, who is that beautiful lady who lives with you in that beautiful palace that has 7 wings? This was a question which even the boy was asking himself. He had often wondered, because all he could remember is that one fine morning he was gathering sticks and suddenly there was a lot of commotion and he found himself standing in front of a beautiful princess and they exchanged garlands, and the next thing he knew was he was here in this new land attending school and living in a beautiful palace with her. So 4-5 years passed like this, when every day they would ask him this question and he would say, After that one day, he asked the princess, Pray, tell me, who are you? And the princess would say, Let it go unsaid today. I will say it to you some other day. And like this, 4-5 years more passed on. And by the time the boy became really very irritated and annoyed that he doesn't know who is she. So one day he said, Listen, if you're not going to tell me today who you are, then I'm going to leave this palace. And then the princess said, Let it be unsaid today. I will say it to you tomorrow. Well, that sounded much better. So the next day, the boy came back from school feeling very excited that finally he's going to know who is this beautiful lady who lives with him in this beautiful palace that has 7 wings. And he asked, So, tell me, who are you? And she said, Not now, after dinner, when you retire to sleep. That sounded like an even better deal. And so, the boy sat down for his supper, and once done, he stepped inside the bedchamber. And what does he see? Oh my! It was beautifully decked with golden lamps and flowers. There were flowers thrown all over the bed. And there was fragrance in the air. And the princess herself was very beautifully dressed. She had gold on her hair, hands, feet. And as she gently made her way to the bed, she was excited to wake up her sleeping husband and finally tell him who she is. And as she put out her hand to touch him, she saw that a dark, ugly, black serpent was coming out, and this evil of a snake had bitten her husband, and now he lay dead on that bed. My 7-year-old heart was hoping for so much. Now that bubble of hope burst with grief. And that grief poured from my eyes. And I asked Granny, what happened next? Well, even the grandmother of a grandmother of a grandmother knows that in a fairy tale, when the main character dies, the story ends. There is no what happened next. But try telling that to a 7-year-old. The heart of a 7-year-old does not believe in death or the end. If at all anything, it catches hold of these words by the collar and gives them one tight slap. And so, my grandmother, like the grandmothers before her, decided to continue the story. And she said, well, the princess took the body of her boy husband, put it on a banana leaf, and allowed it to float down the river. And as that leaf came floating by, it came next to the hut of a magician. And this magician brought in that leaf that held the body of that boy husband, and he started reciting magical poetry. On a monsoon evening, after so much of grief has been poured through the eyes at the unexpected death in a fairy tale, the eyelids of a 7-year-old become very heavy. They become very heavy with sleep, and they gently start falling. And the mystical recitations of the magician start becoming a lullaby, and finally the child falls asleep.